Hey everybody, this is part two, um, or the second, rather I should say the second video of Grandizo Munis's uh, The Revolutionaries in the Face of Russia and World Stalinism from 1926. Um, the video was getting kind of long before, so I wanted to um, break it down so they're easier for myself and other people to listen to later. So I'm just starting at a new paragraph. This isn't like an actual section break. So here we go. From the moment when expanded reproduction, constant capital plus variable capital plus surplus value, finds in the term surplus value not truly a balance of surplus social labor indispensable to social progress, but a category of the population that appropriates and administers it, it becomes impossible to speak of planning. For a revolutionary, planning does not mean projecting any plan of production, which many contemptible capitalist countries are in a position to do today, but a plan that combines investments and constant capital with the necessities of variable capital. Of the three terms of the formula, constant capital is continually passive, whether in capitalism or in transitional society. Reproduction can only rest on variable capital or on surplus value. If reproduction rests on variable capital, the products cease to be commodities and are divided between variable capital, immediate consumption, and constant capital, capitalization for the subsequent increase of consumption in accordance with the interests of the majority of the population. If it is based on surplus value, neither constant capital nor variable capital can grow unless the economic possessions of the minority, which transforms social surplus labor into its own property, are affirmed and increased. Products become commodities again, preventing the normal increase of constant capital, and the system of production comes into conflict with the interests of the proletariat and humanity. Footnote. It is known that since the middle of the third decade of this century, all unprofitable industry has been suppressed in Russia. Moreover, the official Kremlin economists themselves recognize that, quote, in the sixth part of the world, end quote, products are commodities like any savage capitalist country, a fact which they naturally bless as one of the achievements of, quote, socialism, due to the genius of the, quote, father of nations, end quote. See the article by L.A. Leontiev, Political Economy in the Soviet Union, official translation made by the Stalinist journal Science and Society. New York, spring 1944. Yeah, I think that's an interesting thing because, I read a New Politics article that called Monthly Review Press a soft Stalinist press. And Science and Society has this thing where it's like, it is like neutral, like great stuff has been published there. It's supposed to be like a non-sectarian journal of Marxist theory. But I would say that Michael Laibman, for instance, I'm pretty sure is a pretty much a just straight up apologist for the Soviet Union. So, hold on, was his name David Laibman? Did I say David Laibman? Anyway. End footnote. Where the hell am I? Okay. Although it is not possible to fix an exact date, this is what happened in Russia. To assert the contrary, it would be necessary to demonstrate that the intelligentsia did not constitute itself the owner of surplus value. To speak of planning in Russia today is a bloody irony for the masses and a concession to the decadent tendencies of world capitalism. Under Stalinism, there exists only a plan determined by a minority monopolizing surplus value, a plan just as much in conflict with the interests of historical progress as the English or American economy. It would be absurdly blind to seek to distort the previous argument with the trumpets of, quote, national defense. The industrial necessities of military defense do not fail to bear the ignominious stamp of Stalinist slavery. Let us suppose, making a further concession to the defense mechanism, that somewhat out of necessity or largely thanks to the political characteristics of the bureaucracy, almost all surplus labor had to be directed towards heavy industry, all the more so with expanded reproduction in this area of planning and with the exorbitant total surplus value extracted from the masses. In 1929, heavy industry in Russia provided 44.4% of total production. In 1940, 61%. The same proportion in Japanese industry was 33.7% in 1929 and 61.8% in 1939. Starting from a relatively inferior base, a capitalist country with backward technology and feudal social organization achieves an increase notably superior to so-called socialist planning. Even if we force the needs of the masses through the yoke of Stalinist national defense, we see planning vanish before the particular interests of the intelligentsia. Preeminent and prior to everything, without the slightest doubt, national defense is a function of the social minority that monopolizes surplus value. The Stalinist bureaucracy would become, as so many bourgeois have recently become, the agent and instrument of the external enemy as soon as the proletariat seriously threatened its sovereignty. It is hardly necessary to add that the concentration of surplus value as the collective or semi-collective property of the bureaucracy, in many cases the bureaucracy's individual property, is what imprints on the state its terrible counter-revolutionary idiosyncrasy, both in the national and international sphere, and in the economic sphere, that of the distribution of products. In short, Russian society offers us a picture that is completely opposite to the picture of the transitional society given by Marx in the Critique of the Gotha program. On the contrary, it is strikingly similar to Engels' description of the single-owner state On the contrary, it is strikingly similar to Engels' description of the single-owner capitalist state. Quote, "But neither the transformation into joint stock companies nor the transformation into state property removes the quality of capital from the productive forces. For joint stock companies, this is obvious. And in its turn, the modern state is only the organization that bourgeois society gives itself to maintain the general external conditions of the capitalist mode of production in the face of encroachments, both by workers and by individual capitalists. The modern state, whatever its form, is an essentially capitalist machine, the state of capitalists, the ideal collective capitalist." End quote. Engels. Anti-Düring. In the first document of the Spanish group in Mexico on Russia, it was stated, quote, "The bureaucracy must be consciously restorative today," end quote. This was an inaccuracy resulting from an incomplete study of the problem. The bureaucracy is already a collective capitalist. Each bureaucrat is a, quote, "revenue collector," end quote, of which Engels speaks in relation to the transformation of private property into state property. In the Russian economy, we have a particularly ferocious type of state capitalism that duplicates the defects of classical capitalism studied by Marx, opposition between production and social necessities, luxury and waste at the top, pauperism at the bottom, growth of wage slavery, and establishment of a semi-legal slavery that ties the worker to the factory like an additional nut in the machine, production of commodities and exploitation of surplus value, prohibition of the masses from any intervention in economic administration and political direction, furious and degenerate state centralization. And it is useless to speak of the millions of men condemned to forced labor, helots of the counter-revolution, nor of the permanent exactions of the police dictatorship. In this broad sense, capitalist restoration has already taken place. We are only recognizing it belatedly. By rummaging through its interests, the intelligentsia sees that it does not have before it a rupture of planning that would suddenly transform it into a bourgeoisie of the old type. The rupture is a fact more than consummated, and what continues to be called planning is empty of revolutionary significance. The bureaucracy has before it the struggle between its different clans for the distribution of surplus value and the control of the state. It is worth noting here that, according to statistics published by Moscow, the intelligentsia, or revenue collectors, represent 13 to 14% of the population, a proportion similar to that of the bourgeoisie, landowners, merchants, and kulaks combined in Tsarist Russia, 15.9%. Defining what is meant by planning, we point out as one of its conditions the continuous progress of the technical and cultural capacity of workers. Indeed, the exploitation of all economic resources and scientific knowledge for the benefit of society requires the incorporation of the masses into technology and culture. Without this, any revolution, however profound it may be in itself, will resolve itself once again into the exploitation of man by man. The work of the bureaucracy in this area unequivocally denounces it as collective capitalism. Since 1933, workers have had increasingly difficult access to universities, technical schools, and secondary schools. Among those who still manage to go there, we must count a large part of the labor aristocracy in the process of being incorporated into the, quote, income collectors. However, from 1933 to 1938, the proportion of workers in secondary schools fell from 41.5% to 27.1%, meaning that only the labor aristocracy remained. In industrial schools, workers had an even greater participation in 1938, 43.55%, but already the bureaucratic minority and its sons monopolized 45.4% of the positions. Not counting the Stakhanovite labor aristocracy, one of the worst kinds of foremen or prison guards that had ever existed, camouflaged in the percentage of workers. Moreover, with the reestablishment of school registration fees in 1940, access to technical or secondary schools and universities became practically and permanently forbidden to those at the bottom. Hundreds of thousands of poor students had to drop out of schools. The bureaucracy also defined itself as an institution as closed as the bourgeoisie, a reactionary obstacle to social progress. Just as in the economic sphere, in the technical sphere, the smallest step forward is limited by the interests of the collective capitalist bureaucracy. The monopoly of culture is inseparable from the monopoly of surplus value, even when culture has been as degraded as under Stalinism. It is in vain that we will perform metaphysical somersaults. It is in vain that we will claim dialectics to adjust these facts with a supposed continuity of planning. If dialectics is not to be transformed into a straitjacket that paralyzes thought instead of helping thought, if our ideas are not to result in a shriveled and closed creed, dialectics must be at our service and not we at its service. Between the one and the other there is as much difference as between science and religion, the authentic and ersatz. Too frequently we hear in our ranks crackling expressions like, quote, from a dialectical point of view, quote, the dialectical position of the problem, quote, the dialectic of the situation, etc., crowning or beginning reasonings whose relation to dialectics only the devil knows. Here, dialectics begins to be used as a prejudice or dogma replacing reasoning and investigation, with which one seeks to convince by frightening. The more an idea loses its primordial vivacity, and the more one resorts to the sonority of the holy principle, the more one elevates it, lowers it, tampers with it in an attempt to impress simple minds with a, quote, Veda retro satanas, unquote. In the case of dialectics, this use is the very negation of its essence, but we will see the defense's tendency resort to it all the more frequently, the more desperate its situation is. In reality, insinuations have already been made in this direction in an attempt to set in motion the conservative element that exists in every Trotskyist as in every man in general. What does it matter? Exclamation point. To the superstitious Veda retros we oppose not conjurations but the material analysis of historical development. The essence of dialectics irreconcilably in conflict with dogmatism, we will stir with it the profoundly revolutionary spirit of Trotskyism in danger of being anesthetized. Moving from the general to the particular, one does not use dialectics by repeating ad nauseum that economic planning is very progressive, that its objective existence defines the USSR as a, quote, degenerated workers' state. Despite its bureaucratic superstructure, and that the contradiction between the objective of planning and the bureaucratic superstructure must produce a new synthesis, either the reestablishment of proletarian power or a return to capitalism. Only pious minds seeking consolation for the terrible tribulations engendered by Stalinism can empty dialectics of all substance to the point of reducing it to a simple schematic and foolish game of a synthesis established in 1917. a more or less growing bureaucratic antithesis, and a future abrupt, instantly visible synthesis, which must necessarily be bourgeois in the classical sense of this notion, or socialism. Neither the thesis was ever, even in the 5 years following 1917, something pure and firmly established, nor was the bureaucratic antithesis ever limited to the domain of the superstructure, nor did the synthesis have to be necessarily, if it were negative, a sudden return to the bourgeois past. Due to its growing economic differentiation, already monstrous today, the bureaucracy rose in a progressive and evolutionary manner as a structural factor, at the expense of the shaky structure implanted by the revolution, at the expense of the thesis, and forgive us for resorting to ungrateful terminology! Thanks to the showers of dialectics that the partisans of the defense of Russia are already beginning to give themselves. Moreover, after a revolution that has completely annihilated the old possessing classes, a reactionary synthesis can never come about suddenly. This is what Leon Trotsky referred to whenever he spoke of the assimilation of the customs of the vanquished by the victors, as one of the ways of introducing counter-revolution. It is in this interweaving and continual modification of the various factors that the dialectic must be based to determine whether there is anything left to defend in Russia, or whether the counter-revolution is already a fait accompli. We have answered in advance. The triumph of the counter-revolution is a fact. Neither the Russia nor the world proletariat have anything to defend in Russia. But we want to repeat an idea insinuated at the beginning of this work. If the objective economic weight of the bureaucracy was relatively insignificant, around 1922 to 23, the possession of political power gave it the means to increase its economic weight, and this increase, in turn, caused a great general orientation of the economy in favor of the bureaucracy, the transformation of planning into a planned or directed economy. The political factor thus proved decisive, the objective-subjective of the bureaucracy capable of modifying the objective of the economic conquest of October. Thermidor, once triumphant, becomes the principal factor in subsequent determination, not nationalized property, which then entirely escapes the control of the masses. The triumph of the counter-revolution must be the starting point for the Marxist analysis of the Russian phenomenon. It is a necessary consequence of the nature of the socialist revolution. The proletariat, which, unlike the bourgeoisie, cannot be a property-owning class before making its revolution, by ceding political power to social strata to its right, also cedes economic possessions. The bourgeois revolution could endure a Thermidor and Bonapartism without the economic control of society escaping the capitalist class. Both political control, economic control escapes the proletarian revolution. Very similar analysis there to Shachtman. Let us not forget that it is the revolution of revolutions, the emancipation of humanity through the proletariat, the permanent revolution. Its dilemma consists of completing itself or perishing. Some comrades assume that Russia is today at the stage of primitive accumulation of capital, that is, at the stage of the plundering of the majority of the population by the minority, which allows the latter to build up its first capitalization fund. The expression is difficult to apply to the Russian phenomenon, since it refers to a stage of history that will in no way be repeated in Russia. If we were to accept it with the necessary reservations, we would not locate this primitive plunder in 1946, but from the 5-year plans, particularly from the second and third, from the moment when the bureaucracy, having created for itself in the labor aristocracy the indispensable basis for defeating the kulaks and preventing the restoration of the old classes, is heading full steam ahead towards the consolidation and expansion of its economic positions, foreseeing perhaps unconsciously a perspective of its own. The great works of the 5-year plans, carried out almost exclusively with the labor of slave prisoners, literally kneaded with the blood of hundreds of thousands of men, if not millions, constitute with a part the initial plunder of the population by the bureaucratic minority. The other part came from the working class masses in general. Surplus value squandered, hoarded, or converted by individual bureaucrats, either into property in the strict sense of the term, or into state bonds. The fall in the standard of living of the masses was a condition of the economic prosperity of the bureaucracy. Nevertheless, the qualification of primitive accumulation of capital seems to us inadequate because it evokes the bourgeois stage, which is based on the process of primitive plunder described by Marx in Capital. This stage will in no way know a second edition in Russia. It is fading away from everyone's eyes, even in capitalist countries that did not suffer the break in continuity of the October Revolution. It is fading away in whatever way history evolves, with or without a proletarian revolution. The economic and political positions stolen by the bureaucracy do not constitute the starting point for a new development of the old capitalism, something which the comrades who spoke of primitive accumulation certainly agree. What they primitively contain is a type of decadent society towards which, except in the case of a social revolution, the whole world is moving. This idea has nothing in common with bureaucratic collectivism, which regards the present Russian structure as an already stable form, at least in its essential features, and what is worse, as a necessary stage of historical development. Let us recall in passing that Trotsky admitted bureaucratic collectivism as a possible type of future society in the event of a general failure of the revolution. On the contrary, we consider it inconceivable because the bestial arbitrariness that a dictatorship like the Stalinist one presupposes could not last even half a century without corrupting all social relations, including those of the bureaucracy. But those who confine themselves to the reasoning, if the Russian state is not yet a bourgeois state, then it necessarily remains a degenerated workers' state, condemn themselves to a sterile mechanistic materialism. Atomic physics has proven that the motion of a particle is predictable only within the framework of a law of probabilities. What scientific reasoning can deny to a society where man is the supreme factor the freedom available to a particle of inorganic matter? The freedom available to a part of inorganic matter! Exclamation point. The Russian problem must be understood in its own dynamics, taking into account the various projections of classes and political tendencies, their respective international framework, the reciprocal modifications they undergo, and the conditions given by the permanent world crisis, and, a most important factor, the political experiences that go from the Bolshevik Revolution to the triumph of the Stalinist Thermidor, and from the latter to the triumph of the Big Three. All that can be said on this basis is that the Russian state has nothing to do with a worker state, however degenerate it may be, but we would be falling into utopianism if we tried to predict what kind of society it would give birth to. Only if the world proletariat proves incapable of fulfilling its historical mission would the counter-revolution lead to a more stable form. It will in no way be the capitalism of past centuries, although it will resemble it, just as all the social types that have paraded before humanity since primitive communism have resembled it, in the persistence of the exploitation of man by man. When a social form that has realized its possibilities does not resolve itself into a higher form, its constituent elements, classes, property, ideas, decompose and reform themselves during a long period of decadence, in which certain temporary economic upswings are not excluded. The old ruling classes, degenerate and void of energy, are irremediably doomed, and before reaching a new, stable organization, humanity is regressing to blind and brutal times. Despite all that distinguishes it from our time, the decadent Greco-Roman world offers us a rich experience that we must not neglect. After vainly seeking a positive solution to its contradictions, it sank into a prolonged decadence from which feudalism slowly emerged. But the old patrician class, which, in establishing the empire, appeared triumphant in the face of the plebs, was soon supplanted both as owner and ruler by new elements, without genealogy or history, but more energetic than the patricians. During the entire process of its decadence, until a society rested on the feudal form, The transfer of property and power was repeated several times to the benefit of new elements, almost always coming from the army. And in the midst of this constant and unstable reshaping, the state, an omnipotent and vengeful God, ordered, regulated, and centralized everything, including property. The moment when decadence and the march towards feudalism unequivocally began, when the plebs had suffered a decisive defeat, was the establishment of the empire by Julius Caesar and his nephew Octavian. However, many people, including a large part of the plebs themselves and the patricians, considered them, who had established themselves by fighting against Pompey and Antony, direct representatives of the patriciate, as the successors of the Gracchus brothers, and, in a certain way, of Catiline. Some modern historians still refer to Caesar's regime as the, quote, first dictatorship of the left, end quote. In reality, with Caesar, the balance definitively tipped against the positive solution to the social conflict. The new dictator and his successors used the plebs to impose a compromise on the patricians that steered society towards its decomposition, while representing certain formal concessions on the part of the patricians. Nowadays, the Caesars are emerging from Stalinism and social democracy, especially Stalinism. The old bourgeoisie, especially in Europe, has lost confidence in itself and is tending to abandon power to the upstarts who demonstrate an energy it lacks. Through the nationalization of large property, we can already glimpse a period during which plebeian leaders would lead society, more enslaved and exploited than ever, through the abysmal labyrinth of decadence. At first glance, this process seems impossible and monstrous, but upon closer examination, we come to the conclusion that it is already clearly apparent. To cut off its path, powerful revolutionary action by the masses is necessary. Undoubtedly, the masses will offer repeated revolutionary opportunities, but victory requires a reorientation of the vanguard in the direction indicated here. Official workers' leaders are increasingly indispensable to prevent the proletarian revolution. The exploitation of the masses and the dictatorship of the privileged can only be sustained in the long run through workers' leaders. This victory, which, let us repeat, requires at least some measures of nationalization of the means of production, will represent the crucial point in the race towards decadence, with all the cultural regression and decomposition of the proletariat that this entails. The shock force of this process is Stalinism. One would have to be blind not to see it after its action in Eastern Europe. In reality, the struggle that the proletariat and society must wage to find a positive solution to the conflict of our time is defined as follows. Either destroy Stalinism and reformism, or they will arrive sooner or later, through numerous struggles in which they will present themselves as the left wing, as a fusion of compromise with the old society, which will enthrone social decadence in the midst of a dejected proletariat, without confidence in anything, in anyone or in itself, ideologically corrupted and materially decomposing. And at the moment when this prospect looms threateningly, there are Trotskyists who continue to regard Stalinism as progressive, hiding behind the miserable argument, give us figures showing that nationalized property no longer exists in Russia. It is impossible not to fear that the degeneration of the workers' movement will also be felt in our ranks. At risk of appearing verbose, we insist that a capitalist state is defined synthetically by the following features. 1. Private or state property serves to concentrate surplus value in the hands of a social minority. 2. The production and expanded reproduction of the economy are not carried out in the interest of the social majority, but of the minority that appropriates the surplus value. 3. With formal parliamentary democracy or with a declared dictatorship, the working classes are systematically excluded from economic and political management and suffer the dictatorship of the minority. 4. The distribution of products is determined by the law of wage labor, separation of man from the instruments of labor. 5. Technical knowledge and culture in general are kept as a monopoly by the dominant minority. Access to both is closed to the majority. 6. The state increasingly reinforces the capitalist and dictatorial features that it began to take on with the formation of capitalist society within feudal society. Well, ! We see each of these characteristic features of the capitalist state brought to a climax in the Russian state. beginning with the exploitation of the masses. Let us add that state ownership does not deprive the top bureaucracy of the rights of a shareholder in any joint stock company. The bureaucracy has issued, in ever-increasing quantities, bonds and notes bearing substantial income. During and since the war, issues of many billions of rubles were instantly covered and beyond. The hoarded reserves enabled these investments by the collectors of income. Many managers of industry personally possess millions of rubles in bonds notes. Undoubtedly, this is the main fact that determined the new inheritance law. Even a shameful Stalinist like Strachey recognized. John Strachey is like an economist in England or Great Britain. Even a shameful Stalinist like Strachey recognized, even before the war, that bonds and notes were an indirect means of possessing ownership of the great means of production. To justify his services to the Stalinist counter-revolution, Strachey gave a certainty that the Kremlin would resort exceptionally to private capital, and that with the success of the 5-year plans, the issues of bonds and notes would cease. On the contrary, they have multiplied and reached enormous figures, which will not prevent all the Stracheys from continuing to provide theoretical concealment services to the counter-revolution. Finally, it is these interests, in which the prior thefts of the bureaucracy already acquire a certain density, which have prevented the Russian economy from planning itself completely by uniting the producers with the instruments of production, and it is they who in the end transformed it into a simply directed economy, that is to say, limited and regulated by the interests of the dominant caste in a reactionary manner. To me. Jesus Christ, I fucked that sentence up. Let me repeat it. Finally, it is these interests in which the prior thefts of the bureaucracy already acquire a certain density, which has prevented the Russian economy from planning itself completely by uniting the producers with the instruments of production, and it is they who, in the end, transformed it into a simply directed economy, that is to say, limited and regulated by the interests of the dominant caste, into a reactionary economy. The Russian working class has nothing to defend in such a system. Politically, the return of the proletariat to power requires the total destruction of the existing state, since as the Tsarist state was destroyed, or just as the proletariat of any other country must destroy the capitalist state, neither the police nor the courts nor the army have anything in common with the proletariat. Their organization, their ideology, and their respective cadres are closely linked to the interests of the Stalinist counter-revolution. It is no longer a question of employing the machine, but of destroying it. And as for the organs of power, those that still call themselves Soviets in Russia, we know that they are further removed from the masses than the parliament chambers of bourgeois countries. The revival of the Soviets of 1917 to 1922 must extirpate these general staffs of the counter-revolution. Likewise, in the economic sphere, the Russian proletariat faces a whole social revolution, not just a political revolution. Not only does the entire high bureaucracy own property, houses, land, automobiles, jewelry, bonds, and debentures, and large sums of money, but the means of production are actually the collective property of the bureaucracy. By regaining possession, the proletariat will expropriate the collectors of income, who are today the absolute masters of surplus value, and this surplus value will acquire the quality of surplus labor, which is inseparable from any society in transition to socialism. 29 years after the Bolshevik Revolution, all its conquests have been wiped out by the Stalinist counter-revolution. If the Fourth International fails to take this into account and quickly change its policy toward the USSR and world Stalinism, it will be unable to inspire the proletariat the confidence the proletariat lacks today. The Fourth International will condemn itself to impotence, and the crisis of humanity, the crisis of revolutionary leadership, will acquire a permanent character. All right, I'm going to say that's the end of the second video of this essay, because there's a new section here, Russian foreign policy and world Stalinism, and I think it would be nice to start the third video on that. Thank you so much for listening.